Professor Feffer, who I've had the pleasure to already get to know at earlier ICD conferences. Professor John Feffer is the co-director of Foreign Policy in Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies. He's the author of several books and numerous articles. He's been a writing fellow at Provisions Library in Washington, D.C., and a Pan-Tech fellow in Korean Studies at Stanford University. He's the former associate director of World Policy Journal. He has worked as an international affairs representative in Eastern Europe and East Asia for the American Friends Service Committee. He has also studied in England and Russia, lived in Poland and Japan, and traveled widely throughout Europe and Asia. He has taught a graduate-level course on international conflict at the Sung Kong Ho University in Seoul in July 2001, and delivered lectures at a variety of academic institutions, including New York University, Hofstra, Union College, Cornell University, and Sophia University in Tokyo. John has widely been interviewed in print as well as on radio, and he serves on the advisory committees of the Alliance of Scholars Concerned About Korea. He's the recipient of the Herbert W. Scoville Fellowship and been a writer in residence at Blue Mountain Center at the Wurlitzer Foundation. The lecture topic he's chosen today, I think, couldn't be more perfect for the conference that we have. We tend to focus very often on the positives, in the sense soft power is the solution for everything. And I think you're going to help us to remember that maybe there are some cases where it's more appropriate than others. The lecture topic Professor Feffer has chosen, When Soft Power Works and When It Doesn't. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a very, very warm welcome for John Feffer. Thank you.
I want to start with the question, does anybody know where the oldest Chinatown is? Anybody want to guess? San Francisco? No. It's not in the United States. Does that help? Japan? No, but that's a good guess. Korea, also a good guess. No. The oldest Chinatown is in Manila, in the Philippines. And the Chinese government is very proud of this fact, and it will repeat it over and over again to demonstrate that China has been present in the Philippines for a long, long time. It will repeat it on its TV station in the Philippines called Chinoy TV. It will repeat it at one of the 3 Confucian Institutes that are in the Philippines. You have heard of the Confucian Institutes, haven't you? Confucian Institutes are basically places that China has set up all around the world to teach Chinese language, teach Chinese culture. Very, very popular, very, very successful, and there are 3 of them in the Philippines. China will also repeat its long-standing connections with the Philippines when it's talking about trade. Back in 1996, China wasn't even in the top 10 in terms of Philippines trade partners. This year, it's number 3. And after a recent kind of bilateral discussion between Manila and Beijing, there was a promise that by 2016, China will be number 1. And that's actually pretty common in the Asia-Pacific region, where China is a leading trade partner for many of the countries there. So from all of this, you might say, ever since Chinatown was established in Manila back in the 16th century, soft power has worked. China and the Philippines have this great relationship. Except there's a couple of things I've left out of this. There's, for instance, a place called Mischief Reef. Mischief Reef, you can guess by its name, that's not exactly Club Med. It's little islands that are off the shores of the Philippines that are within the economic zone of the Philippines. Not very far to get to Mischief Reef from the Philippines. But the problem is that back in the 1990s, China set up some structures on Mischief Reef in an attempt to claim Mischief Reef as part of its own territory. You see, Mischief Reef is part of South China Sea area. South China Sea is perceived by China as basically its backyard. Philippines didn't fight back. They didn't attack China after China established these structures. They weren't happy. Philippines were not happy. But they didn't deploy hard power in response. But back in 2011, they did send a ship out around Mischief Reef and nearby Scarborough Reef to check out what might be oil reserves underneath these islands. And China wasn't happy about that. There were some Chinese fishing boats there, and the Philippines seized some Chinese fishermen. You might remember that. That was in the headlines. China wasn't happy about that. Again, there's no war going on here. There's no hard power versus hard power, but there was a lot of unhappiness. China said, well, we're just not going to import your bananas any longer. And so lots of bananas piled up in ports China didn't take. China and the Philippines going head to head over this issue. Now, it's not, of course, just China and the Philippines. The South China Sea is an area that's being disputed by many nations. China has, as I said, laid claim to, well, a large chunk of the South China Sea. It deploys what's called the 9-dash line. And if you look on a map, which we don't have, but if you imagine a map, and the South China Sea is kind of like a big bay, really. The 9-dash line hugs the coastline all the way around, basically a big gulp out of the South China Sea that China has claimed. And the Philippines is not just worried about Mischief Reef, it's not just worried about the 9-dash line and China's claims, it's worried more generally about Chinese hard power and its military spending. In 2012, for instance, China increased its military spending by 11%. That's double digits. That's a lot, okay? Now, what that pushes military spending in China above is about $100 billion. You compare that to American military spending, we have nothing to worry about. I mean, we spend, upwards of $700 billion a year, $100 billion from the Chinese. Not a major threat, although some politicians will claim otherwise. But if you're sitting in Manila, or you're sitting in Vietnam, or you're sitting in Singapore, you're worried about $100 billion in military spending. And you're worried about double-digit increases because it looks like things are just going to get bigger and bigger. So, on the one hand, you have this soft power approach from China that seems on the face of it to be very successful. 3 Confucian institutes, Chinoi TV, long-standing cultural relationship. But the effect, which is to influence the Philippines, to bring the Philippines closer into Chinese orbit, is completely undercut by Chinese hard power. The two exist simultaneously, but soft power in this case does not seem to be working from China's point of view. It is a failure. It's a failure in part because it pushes the Philippines in the completely opposite direction, not toward China, but toward the United States. You might remember that back in the beginning of the 90s, the United States had to close 2 military bases in the Philippines, and there was a crest of anti-American sentiment in the Philippines that coalesced around the calls to close these military bases. And there were a lot of complaints about prostitution around the base, about the necessity to maintain high military spending as a result of US military connection. And the result of it, after the explosion of a volcano nearby that covered the 2 bases in volcanic dust, finally the closure of these 2 military bases. But more recently, as a result again of Chinese hard power, the Philippines has basically thrown open these bases and said, please come back, Americans. We want you again. We want you because we're worried about China. And we will double the amount of foreign military financing, the amount of money that we're getting from the United States in military hardware and support. And we will increase our basing agreement with you, all as a result of Chinese hard power. So again, we have a case in which Chinese strategy has produced the opposite of what it ultimately wants. So, as Mark said, the topic of this presentation is where soft power works and where it doesn't work. And I've given you an example of where obviously it doesn't seem to be working. And I want to understand why this doesn't seem to be working in China's case. And I'm going to look at the United States. I'm going to look at the European Union. I'm going to look at a bunch of different cases and try to extract out perhaps some principles for where soft power works and where it doesn't. First definition, which you might have already gotten, I don't know. Where does soft power come from? Comes from Professor Nye of Harvard, who introduced the topic in 1990. And he stressed the importance of power with rather than power over. In other words, cooperation, working with other countries rather than, well, dominating other countries, stressing cultural power, diplomatic/political power, economic power, all of the things in addition to hard military power. And now the timing of this was, of course, very important, 1990, the end of the Cold War, and what was perceived as a declining utility of military force. After all, Soviet Union collapses, and it collapses not because we attacked it, collapses not because NATO surged with its tanks across Europe into the Soviet. No, it just collapsed from its own weight and its own corruption. And NATO never fired a shot. In fact, up until much later in the 1990s, NATO in its existence never fired a shot throughout the entire Cold War. So people were thinking in 1990, well, we've spent all of this money, all of these billions and billions of dollars on military hardware, and yet we won the Cold War without firing a shot. Maybe we should reinvestigate the various tools in our toolbox and ask ourselves, well, maybe there are more powerful levers of influence out there. And why should we be putting all of our eggs into the hard power basket? And along comes Professor Nye and says, look, really should they be thinking about soft power? This was, of course, not a white flag. This was an attempt to say, look, the world is changing. We live in a multipolar world in which we're seeing other sources of power emerge. We have to change our strategy to preserve US influence in this multipolar world. Now, there was, of course, what we might call the Friedman Corollary to this notion of soft power. And this is Thomas Friedman, the New York Times op-ed writer, who said, well, soft power is fine. I like my McDonald's Big Macs. I see McDonald's appearing all around the world, but let's get serious, people. McDonald's is not going to fight our wars for us. McDonnell Douglas is going to be fighting our wars. We cannot have one without the other. McDonald's plus McDonnell Douglas is America's future. Soft power is only successful when there is hard power there behind it. People are only going to eat those Big Macs, those nasty little hamburgers, if there's American military power behind that, more or less. In other words, the fist of hard power will come in a velvet glove. This is the Thomas Friedman Corollary. Now, after 2001, it seemed as though we saw the kind of resurgence of hard power, the emphasis on the Friedman Corollary, the importance of building up the Pentagon under George W. Bush, an expansion of US military power, doubling of the Pentagon, preemptive wars, a return to kind of US military power that we hadn't seen for many, many years. There was some soft power associated with that, but the emphasis had clearly shifted to hard power during the Bush years. And this was an attempt not to preserve US influence in a multipolar world, but to preserve US unipolar position in the world. We were, after the Cold War, the only real military superpower left. And some people wanted to keep it that way. Forget about the rise of the rest. We have to maintain US military supremacy. And the only way to do that was not through the export of McDonald's, but the beefing up of McDonnell Douglas. Now, we are in, again, a different world than we were in those immediate years after 2001. We have, from the writings of Hillary Clinton, emerged into a different space in which the contrast between hard power and soft power has been resolved into one power. And that power is smart power. Smart power is the big toolbox in which everything is inside. And we smartly choose what to use according to the circumstances. Maybe it's appropriate to use hard power if we're dealing with militants in shadowy area of Pakistan, but certainly we would not use drones if we were unhappy with the French. We use a different way of influencing the French. Smart power emerges as this kind of synthesis of the two approaches of hard power and soft power, a kinder, gentler version of Friedman's Corollary. Now, this too is a strategy that is well suited to the times we are in the same way the soft power was put forward at the end of the Cold War when we saw a tremendous shift in geopolitics. We are experiencing a similar shift today in which we are finally seeing modest drawdown in Pentagon spending, maybe more modest depending if the sequestration goes through, but in any case, we're seeing some drawdown in military spending. We're seeing a withdrawal of US troops from Iraq, from Afghanistan. We're seeing some expansion of US influence military-wise elsewhere in the world, but certainly a perception that the US military is starting to draw down, and that we need a different strategy for understanding this more complex world we are in. Okay, so that was a kind of long discussion of where soft power came from and how we got to smart power, from soft power to smart power. Now I want to get to the heart of the question, where soft power works and where it doesn't work. Well, here at AU, you have a public diplomacy department, a couple of professors who have written very ably, I think, on the issue of where public diplomacy has failed so thoroughly. And those examples are, of course, Iraq and Afghanistan, where the Bush administration, although it was emphasizing hard power, did say that it was going to hire an advertising executive, Charlotte Beers, send her over to Iraq to figure out ways of deploying soft power. And this was going to be the signature effort of the Bush administration to put a happier face on occupation. And of course, it didn't work. It didn't work for the most part. People didn't watch the television shows. They didn't buy the magazines. They basically didn't buy what Charlotte Beers was producing. Here we see, I think, a most important lesson about soft power. That basically, soft power doesn't work when hard power is so obviously the emphasis. When soft power is the little frill on top, the little furbelow, the bow that is on the package of military power. It's pretty obvious to the people in those countries that this is not the serious part of American foreign policy, that this is just a kind of sideline. So it obviously was not very successful. We didn't put that much money into it. We didn't seriously engage the culture of the country that we were in, Iraq, and later Afghanistan, when we ramped up our soft power efforts there. We were still, despite some good efforts, flat-footed. We didn't understand how to make soft power successful. In other places, soft power is equally unsuccessful. One important aspect of smart power, this evolutionary trend, is civil-military cooperation. If we are going to have a successful approach combining military power and soft power, why not have State Department and Pentagon work together? For instance, why not have soldiers deliver humanitarian aid in Africa? Why not have them engage in nation building, in construction projects, and so forth? Well, on the face of it, that sounds like a pretty smart thing to do. Why? Because military has a lot of money. There are a lot of resources there. Why not leverage that for good? And in some cases, that has been successful. But in other cases, it hasn't been successful. And it's the humanitarian workers who have stepped forward and said, why? And the reason why is that when their work is so closely connected to hard power, to military power, to soldiers, to guns, to the explicit US foreign policy aims in Africa, then they lose the trust of the communities that they're working in. The most important commodity for a humanitarian worker is trust. And when you lose that trust, you can't work in that community any longer. And if you are going in with guns, and if you're going in with an explicit hard power at your back, you're going to lose that trust. So that was another case where hard power was complicating the mission of soft power in Africa. The Muslim world. I heard just the end of your presentation about perceptions in the Muslim world about US foreign policy. And this is the great paradox of US policy under Obama. Here is a president who went to Cairo, gave a great speech on re-engaging the Muslim world. Looked like US policy was fundamentally going to shift. It was going to recognize the achievements of the Muslim world. It was going to take Muslim culture and religion seriously, going to respect the wishes of Muslims on the ground. He got a lot of applause in Cairo, and he got a lot of positive op-eds in papers in the Arab world and the Muslim world afterwards. But the paradox was that if you look at opinion polls, other than a modest surge immediately after that speech, US standing in the Muslim world declined again, and declined even further than it had been during the George W. Bush administration. So why did this happen? Well, it happened precisely for the reason you said, the perception that US foreign policy is about killing Muslims in predominantly Muslim countries. Our drone policy in Pakistan, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, the Obama administration says we don't kill civilians. They're extremely accurate. But the reports from other agencies argue quite the opposite, that the number of civilian casualties associated with drone attacks, including women and children, is in the hundreds, possibly more than 1,000. And those casualties make it into the headlines all over the Muslim world. And even if percentage-wise we're not talking about a huge number of casualties, in terms of the pictures that are distributed, in terms of the television coverage, it dominates people's understanding of US foreign policy. So here again, we have a hard power strategy which completely undercuts our soft power messages and approaches. There is another distinction that I thought I'd introduce at this point, not just soft power and hard power, but the distinction between empire and hegemony. Empire basically is trying to get another country to do what you want it to do against its will. Hegemony is where the other country will do what you want it to do, but it will do it thinking that that's what it wants to do. Let me give you an example from the world of fast food. Coca-Cola. We drink Coca-Cola because we think we like Coca-Cola. It's sweet, it's bubbly, it has caffeine in it. By this point, I'd be hard-pressed to find anybody in the room who either hasn't tried Coca-Cola or hasn't liked it at some level. But if you go to the Coca-Cola archives and you read the letters from people in countries when Coca-Cola was first introduced, there wasn't anybody who liked it when they first tried it. They thought it was nasty. They thought it tasted like sneakers. They thought it tasted like old socks. Very few people liked it. But eventually, because of a very sophisticated advertising campaign and attempt to get Coca-Cola widespread throughout various countries, Coca-Cola did succeed. And so you've gone from the empire of Coca-Cola, in which it was forcing Coca-Cola down people's throats, literally, to the hegemony of Coca-Cola, in which people voluntarily go out and buy the stuff, even though their grandparents thought it was the most noxious liquid around. So that's the distinction between empire and hegemony. And essentially, empires are held together by hard power predominantly, but hegemony often is a mixture of hard power and soft power, with a lot of emphasis on soft power. Where are we successful in terms of the United States, in terms of hegemony, in terms of having our allies do what we want them to do, but doing so because they think it's their interest too. In other words, a convergence of interests. Japan is an obvious example. We've had an alliance with Japan ever since the end of World War II. And the Japanese, very more or less happily, mainland at least, accept US military bases, pay a lot of money to support those US military bases, and are very happy to have an alliance with the United States. So this is more or less a hegemonic relationship between two allies, the United States and Japan. In terms of spreading this hegemonic model, where have we been more or less successful? Well, for the Obama administration, I'd say one of the signal foreign policy achievements, and there haven't been a lot, but one has been Burma. The Obama administration played it pretty cool, shall we say, with Burma. Didn't go in there all heavy with hard power, threatening the military junta. Just kind of hung back, had some quiet discussions, kept the lines open with Aung San Suu Kyi, and eventually the junta decided to talk back. This was the one example when President Obama, as a candidate, said, instead of threatening countries with a fist, we'll hold out a hand, and countries that hold out a hand in return will shake. So of all those countries in the world that he listed, basically only Burma has reached out its hand to shake. And the lessons here, I think, are very important. The reason why Burma has opened up, not completely, but has opened up a little bit to the United States is because, again, number one, the US is not deploying hard power strategies there. Number two, the United States represents an ideal. Again, the United States not as a country that's represented by its Pentagon, but a country that's represented by its Constitution, its Bill of Rights, its history of support for human rights approaches. The best part of the US tradition. The United States represents an ideal for Burma. It also represents, of course, a counterweight. Burma is very concerned about China, just as the Philippines is very concerned about China. And for a very long period of time, Burma was highly dependent on China. And so the United States represents an important counterweight there. And then the United States is an entry ticket to the larger international community. If the United States gives its imprimatur, like the Good Housekeeping seal, other countries follow suit. Say, hey, the United States likes Burma, we'll follow suit. This is a very important soft power strategy that the United States has, that it can deploy, but it doesn't always deploy. Look at North Korea. North Korea has been basically begging the United States to be its entrance into the international community. Of course, North Korea has also said we'll have a nuclear weapon just in case, and that's complicated matters. But in any case, the United States has said, no, we're not. Even if and this is the paradox, even if we would like North Korea to transform itself into a capitalist country, we will not support US corporations like Google to go over there to make it happen. We can go into why the United States has taken such a bizarre position, but in any case, it demonstrates the importance of the United States as an entry ticket. Okay, so finally, I want to just give a couple other examples of what I consider to be the most successful cases of soft power. So I've talked about Philippines, where China has attempted soft power and so far has not been successful because of its hard power ambitions. I've talked about where hard power has complicated US ambitions in the Middle East, the Muslim world, in Africa around humanitarian aid missions. But now I want to end with the European Union, because I think the European Union is perhaps the most successful example of soft power influence in the world today. And I'll give you 3 examples from Bulgaria, Croatia, and Serbia. Bulgaria was one of the most recent entrants of the European Union. And Bulgaria, since I was there in October and I hadn't been there for quite a long time, Bulgaria has changed dramatically. If you drive from Sofia to the Black Sea, you'll see all these signs that just say EU, 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 which are all the EU infrastructure projects that are improving roads, that are rebuilding structures. You see very visibly the advantages of Bulgaria's entrance into the European Union. But sometimes it's a lot more subtle than that. It's the way Bulgarians begin to understand themselves. And that is perhaps most dramatically illustrated by a little decal that you see when you ride on the tram in Sofia. And it's a decal that encourages people to not litter. And it says, please people, be European, don't litter. I was like, whoa. That sets up a kind of interesting assumed contrast between Bulgarians who litter now and Europeans who don't litter. And this process of becoming European, of exerting this kind of informal pressure on people to stand straighter and act better. It's very important in Bulgaria. In Croatia, the influence is even more dramatic. Croatia, of course, is on track to become a member of the European Union this July. It'll be the most recent member. But in order to get there, basically Croatia had to deal with impunity. It had to deal with the war crimes that it was accused of during the wars of the 1990s, most importantly going after its top general, Ante Gotovina. It was only when Croatia, and this was, if you read Carla Del Ponte's memoirs, and she was the head of the tribunal dealing with war crimes after the wars in Yugoslavia, it's her obsession, get Croatia to hand over Ante Gotovina, their general. She spends pages and pages and pages about her negotiations, and finally they get him and they bring him to The Hague. Now, of course, more recently he was let off because of some technicalities, and Croatia was delighted and Serbia wasn't. But that's another story. The most important thing was, it wasn't just Gotovina. It was a whole culture of impunity in Croatia, a whole culture of not respecting the rule of law internationally and within the country. And the EU was like, you are not getting into this European Union until you stand up, walk straight, and get rid of this culture of impunity. And Croatia has largely done that. And it's very impressive to see what has happened. It's not, paradise over there by any stretch of the imagination. But again, the EU had this soft power stick, and it wielded it very successfully. And then finally, Serbia. Serbia would desperately like to be in the European Union. Of course, it doesn't want to give up Kosovo, and this is going to be a challenge over the next many years. But we're seeing some changes taking place in Serbia just as a result of its desire to get into the European Union. Perhaps the most difficult one is going to be LGBT, lesbian, gay rights. For several years, lesbian gay community has tried to have a march in downtown Belgrade. The first time it did it, it was basically attacked by far right-wing elements, and the government used that as an excuse to close it down. Said, hey, it's obviously too dangerous to do this. Now, of course, the government could have said, well, you should have the march and we'll protect you, but the government didn't do that because it was under pressure by the right wing and by the church, largely, not to allow the march to go forward. When it canceled it this year, immediately, the EU came out and said, you guys want to be part of the EU, you gotta let this happen. These are fundamental human rights. You want to be part of our club, you got to obey the rules. So I think it's just a matter of time before that march goes forward. I suspect next year, probably. So I'll end with this contrast. The contrast is between two different kinds of clubs. One club is the mafia. And the mafia gives you deals that you cannot refuse because it'll break your arm if you refuse. That is the essence of hard power. That is the essence of empire. And it can be very effective. Believe me, I would not try to tell you that the mafia has not been effective in its time. But its effectiveness is limited and it's short term. The other club is the European Union. And that club is just like the club when you were 6 years old and you wanted to be part of that treehouse and you climbed up those steps and there was a sign and it said, 6 rules. You follow these 6 rules, we'll let you into the clubhouse. And that's what the EU is today. And it's extraordinarily successful as a soft power model. Thank you very much.